have tonight, this is the last Lehigh Valley JAJAJA member Pecha Kucha talk of 2020, a crazy 2020 year. We're ready to kind of wrap it up and celebrate all together. So again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have our special local guest, Ellen Bearn, was born in Kyoto and lived there for pretty much most of her life, except for the 3 years she spent in the U.S. until graduating from the international school, Canadian Academy in Kobe. She came to the U.S. for college, and after graduating, she worked in New York for a Japanese company, the Dai Nippon Printing Company. And her husband, who is a professor, came to Lehigh to teach philosophy. And so that's what brought them to the Bethlehem, Lehigh Valley area in Pennsylvania, where they raised 2 daughters, and now they are empty nesters. She earned our master's in arts in Japanese pedagogy in 2004 and has been teaching Japanese for over 15 years. Even before the COVID pandemic, her teaching has been online, and through the Bethlehem Tondabayashi Sister City Commission and the Lehigh Valley JAJAJA community, she has been happy to stay connected to Japan because she's got a long history that she's about to tell us, that she's a legacy, her family legacy. It's a really a quiet treasure that she's being able to share with us tonight. So without further ado, Ellen, I'd love to, bring you up on the stage and I'll share my screen. Sound good?
Yep, thank you.
All right. So here we go, Ellen.
So thank you. I'm happy to see everybody here tonight. And I will begin my story in Kyoto, where I was born. And my first school was kindergarten. And there is a kindergarten that Doshisha University has under its huge education umbrella. So that was my first school. And that was in the late 50s, as you can see. And one of the things I did was go with my classmates to the local policeman at the local Koban to thank him for everything he did for us. And we took him flowers. And Doshisha University is a Christian school. So the kindergarten, of course, had to put on the nativity play. And there I am as Mary on the right. And I don't need to tell you which one I am because I stood out. I was blonde as a child, so I really stood out. Next, please. After kindergarten, I went to Japanese school in the neighborhood, Muromachi Shogakko, which was nearby, for 2 years. And this is my first grade group. We took a field trip to Takaragaike, which is in northern Kyoto. And my teacher on the left was very kind. I just remember her as being a very warm and wonderful teacher. Next, please. So this is the whole group, first grade group, and it's pretty big class, I guess, but that's how it was. I think about 40. And I remember just as any kid who's fortunate enough to have a good family life and have happy memories, it was a wonderful childhood. And I never felt like I stood out, even though I did. Nobody teased me, nobody was mean to me. I was just one of the kids. Next, please. So here are my stomping grounds in Kyoto. The green and yellow rectangle is the Imperial Palace called Gosho. And the top arrow is Sokokuji Temple. So I lived between that temple and the Gosho. In that area between the temple and the Gosho is the Doshisha area. So my home was right there. and the kindergarten was right around there too. And my elementary school is up in the second one on the left, the second arrow. And after second grade, we spent a year in America. And when we went back to Kyoto, I switched to international school. So I went to the Kyoto International School from third to sixth grade. So this was a very familiar area to me. And it's the kind of place where I knew the cracks in the sidewalk. Next, please. So on the left is Sokokuji Temple, and on the right is the Gosho. So these are the two places where I played a lot. And the Sokokuji Temple grounds was where our neighborhood Radio Taiso was done. And most of you probably know that Radio Taiso is exercises that are set to music that many people do in Japan. And it was suggested that we go in the summers during summer vacation. And we would have a little pass book, and they would stamp every day when we went to the exercise early in the morning. And although the blonde kid in the lower right is not me, it might as well be, because that is a playground where I played. Within Gosho, there's a little playground, or many playgrounds, but one near my house. Next, please. So growing up, as 64 approached, Japan was really booming and was an economic powerhouse. And with the Olympics in Tokyo in 64 and the first bullet train, these were two sort of very, very proud moments where Japan could show itself to the rest of the world as a worthy nation on the world stage. And I knew that Japan was a special place personally, and also I knew that it was going to be one of those, a country that would make an impact on the rest of the world. And then about 10 years later, when I went to college in 73, I was dismayed to find out that many people my age, who I expected to be a little bit more worldly and better aware of things happening in the world, like in Japan, were so ignorant that it was really surprising to me. They asked me if people really live in paper houses. They said sushi is disgusting. Is Japan, what part of China is Japan? And I was very dismayed when I heard these kinds of questions. And I like to think that now, just a general understanding of Japan, and there's so many parts of Japanese culture that are popular that nobody would say such things anymore. Next, please. So why was I born in Japan? Well, it wasn't just my parents and it wasn't just my grandparents, but my great-grandparents first went to Japan. My great-grandfather, Otis Carey, and my father is also Otis Carey, so I call this one Otis Carey 1, was born in Massachusetts, and I put some key dates relevant to Japan here. So soon after, while he was a young boy, Japan opened to the U.S., and then, of course, the first year of Meiji was 1868. And another important figure in my family story is Joseph Hardy Nijima, who is called Nijima Jo, his Japanese name, was the founder of Doshisha University. And he was at Amherst at the same time that my great-grandfather was, and was the reason that my great-grandfather not the reason he went to Japan, but the reason he went to teach later at Doshisha. So in 1875, soon after my great-grandfather graduated from Amherst, Doshisha was established. And my great-grandparents went to Japan in 1878, and he, with his wife, whose name was Ellen, and I'm named after her. So they spent time in Okayama and Osaka, and then later in Kyoto, where he became professor at Doshisha. And for how many years is that? 20 some years. And he wrote a history of Christianity in Japan, the red books there. And later he returned to the US and he worked with Japanese Americans in California and Utah well before World War II, and then died in Massachusetts. So let me tell you a little bit more about Joseph Hardy Nijima. Next, please. And he was born during the period when Japan was isolated from the West, and Japanese citizens were not allowed to go to the West. But he was determined to go to America, and 1864, under penalty of death, if he'd been found out, he stowed away on a ship, an American ship, and he became friendly with the captain and the owner of the ship, who sponsored him to attend Amherst. And he was the first Japanese person to get a bachelor's degree in the US. And he was so taken by the kind of education he had at Amherst College, and at some point he converted to Christianity, that he wanted to found a Christian university like an Amherst in Japan. And he did that in 1875, sorry. And my great-grandfather overlapped with him at Amherst, and then later went to teach at Doshisha. Next, please. Then my grandfather happened to be born in Massachusetts during my great-grandparents' leave in the US. Had his childhood in Kyoto, and he was sent back to high school in Newton, Mass, and then went to Amherst. And after he got his divinity degree, he went back to Japan and had a church in Otaru, which is in Hokkaido. And also later spent some time in Matsuyama and Shikoku and Nishinomiya, which is near Osaka. And in 1941, his wife and daughter, the youngest of my father's siblings, left Japan before 1941. But my grandfather stayed till the very end and was left Japan on the last ship that Americans and other enemy people, citizens, left on to the Philippines, where he, as a minister, he worked with a Japanese community and a Japanese church. And then he was in a prison camp, a Japanese prison camp in Manila. And the book you see on the right is a collection of letters that he wrote to his family, which were not sent. Nobody saw them. And my family assumed that he was not alive, but no one knew anything about his situation. And he was not well. He had very bad health problems, mostly to do with malnutrition. But he survived. And after he recovered his health, he went back to Japan and worked in the Kansai area with various churches. And then retired to Plainfield, Massachusetts, where he was the minister of the Congregational Church and the town clerk. And then he went to Claremont outside of Los Angeles to a retirement community and died my freshman year in college. Then we have my father, Otis Carey, too, although he's not called the second one. And he was born in Otaru, which is Sapporo's port city, and went to primary school in Otaru. And you see in the younger, the right pictures on the right are him as a young boy and then in elementary school uniform. Then he was sent to Canadian Academy in Kobe. That should sound familiar because that's where I went for middle school, and then to Deerfield in Massachusetts for high school. And in 1939, he went to Amherst. And of course, the war had started soon after that. And he was in his third year when the war started. And in 1942, he wanted to join the Navy because he thought he could be helpful since he knew about Japan and that he could help in the war effort against the enemy, Japan, which was his home country in many ways. And the Navy gathered people like my father who had some knowledge of Japanese language and culture and gave them education in reading and writing, since in my father's case, his speaking was good, but his reading and writing weren't that good. So he had about a year of Japanese language training, first at Berkeley. Then when the Japanese Americans were relocated into the camps in various places, this school had to relocate. So they went to University of Colorado, where the school was reestablished, and they continued with their Japanese language studies. During the war, he married my mother, Alice Shepard, who at that time was in medical school. She is a doctor. And then after the war, he went back to Amherst to finish college. And in 1947, he and my mother went to Japan, to Doshisha, where my father was a representative of Amherst College at Doshisha. And then retired, moved to Oakland and with my mother, and then in 2006, he died. So what happened during the war? Next, please. One of the things he did was he was a prisoner of war director or an interrogator. I don't know if he was actually the director, but he used to call them his prisoners. They were his pals, because he could speak colloquial Japanese so easily. He befriended many of these people that were his prisoners. And the one with the yellow arrow ended up later working at Doshisha as a custodian at the place that we lived. And on the right, you see him many years later reading a message at my father's memorial service at Doshisha. And we affectionately called him Nakano Oji-san, and his wife was Nakano Oba-san, and they were part of the family, really. Next, please. And in my father was introduced to Prince Takamatsu, who was the younger brother of the emperor. And after the war, he would tell Prince Takamatsu that it would be a good idea if the emperor was not so distant, and that if he traveled in the country and met ordinary people and had pictures of the imperial family published, so that he would seem more human and less like a god, which is sort of what he'd been treated as pre-war and during the war. So I can't say to what degree it was my father who had anything to do with it, but he was asked Prince Takamatsu to suggest that to the emperor. And that is my sister, Beth. Next, please. So after the war, my father would meet with his prisoners often. I don't know if it was every year that they had a reunion, but it could have been every year. So obviously the left is 48, the middle is 75, and the right, I think, is in the 80s, and I put an arrow at my father's, where my father is. So these were very festive, happy gatherings that they held. And in the middle picture to the right of my father is Nakano Obasan, the woman who was in the picture a few slides back. And when my father went back to Japan right after the war by himself with the occupation, he went to see many of the families of these people to tell them that their sons were still alive, because they still hadn't gone back to Japan yet. So they were very moved, since they didn't know if their sons were alive or not, but he was able to tell them that they were. Next, please. So the bottom picture shows Amherst House, which is a dormitory, or then was a dormitory and a kind of international center, built long before the war in 1932 by funds from Amherst College. And I lived in the second floor on the right side, behind that big bush. There was an apartment for us, and we lived there for until a new house was built in the back. And many, many famous, illustrious people came through, and you can see an example of 3 of them there. And this was before I was born, but even during my childhood, lots of prominent people came through to give talks and to meet with students, and it was special being there, surrounded by all these amazing people from all over the world, but largely from America, since we were kind of America, without Amherst being in America, we were more involved with American visitors. Next, please. So little did I know that many years later, when I was in Bethlehem, I would end up visiting or being so close to what was our sister city. I didn't know anything about Tondabayashi growing up, but it's all part of the same Kansai world, and Kansai has a big cultural identity. So even though Tondabayashi is not right next to Kyoto, it shares a lot of the same kind of cultural attitude as a Kansai location. So I'm thrilled that I'm involved with the Tondabayashi group. It keeps my connection to Japan, and also in a way to Kyoto, because it's part of the Kansai world. And next, please. So although my father died some time ago, my mother is still living in Oakland at her retirement community. And she turned 100 in June of this year. And we were planning a gathering with my brother and sister who live in Japan. We're all set to come, and many of her grandchildren, and probably even a great grandchild would have been able to visit. But we had to change our plans, as for reasons that are obvious. But fortunately, my mother was able to have a celebration outdoors at her retirement community on her actual birthday, with my sister on the right and my mother's sister, my aunt, on the left, who they all live in Oakland. So for them, it was just a local visit. So there were quite a few of my mother's friends from her retirement community gathered in the courtyard for celebration. And so my mother has her own story, as I wrote. And since my family on my father's side has been in Japan for many generations, I don't feel there's a family home, because my mother's side of the family has also been in another country for 4 generations. My mother was born in Turkey, and her grandparents first went to Turkey in about 1900. So although we are American by nationality, my family hasn't really lived in this country for many generations. So I don't have a specific place that I consider home here, but I'm definitely part of both worlds, and even a little bit part of Turkey. So I hope that you found that somewhat enlightening or interesting, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about my story.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan. Such a unique connection, and for 4 generations, including yours, right? To have such a deep, it's not just visiting Japan, you know, it's not just, oh, I'm a tourist in Japan. It's fully investing in the relationship between the US and Japan through the wars, through despite amazing challenges that your family has gone through. I mean, yeah, incredible. So from all of us, thank you so much for sharing a piece of your family history with us.
Well, I feel really lucky that that was my life. That is my life.